Hi and welcome to this analysis of the game Gregory Kaidanov against Jorden van Foreest. Let's talk about the players before we jump into the game. Gregory Kaidanov, aged 64, is still rated above 2550, so a very strong player. At his time, 30 years ago, he used to be one of the strongest players. He was born in what is now Ukraine, I believe, and moved to the US, played for the US national team quite successfully. Jorden van Foreest, the black player, is a Super-Grandmaster, not very old, a second of Magnus Carlsen, and as I said, a very strong player. This being said, it's also important to mention that the game was very surprising, so let's jump into the game. The white player Gregory Kaidanov opens first d4, and Jorden van Foreest responds knight to f6, a move which he's playing frequently, c4, c6, and this looks unconventional, but actually it's just a transposition into a Slav. So after knight c3, black plays d5, and this is very much a Slav defense against d4, c4. So white plays e3. He could have gone knight to f3, but then there's this additional option of d takes c4, and this move immediately winning a pawn, maybe temporarily, maybe in long term. But as mentioned, white just goes e3, and now taking on c4 would just help white to develop his bishop to c4 in one move, and we will see why I mention in one move in a moment. So instead, black goes for e6, and this is the so-called semi-Slav variation with e6 and c6, c6 being the semi-Slav, the Slav, and e6 the semi-Slav. Of course, with this c6 combination. So knight f3, and now a very weird move, bishop to e7. Before we continue the game, let's just look what the normal move here is, and this is knight b to d7. Why? Because let's say bishop to d3, now white moved the bishop, so black feels fine with taking on c4, because white already lost a tempo by playing bishop to d3. The bishop is on c4, but only for one move, because here comes b5, the bishop has to go, and bishop to d3, by far the most popular move. And now the main line is bishop to b7, and white has a choice, but let's say castle, and a6, e4, c5. This is the old main line, and this opening had been played by Jorden van Foreest a few games ago previously. So Kaidanov might have been well aware that this variation might happen, but instead Jorden van Foreest tried to surprise his opponent with bishop to e7, and he played it incredibly fast. According to Chess24, it took him exactly 6 seconds. So this has to be preparation. And white, after thinking for 1 minute, plays bishop to d3 anyway. D takes c4. As mentioned earlier, bishop takes c4, b5, bishop to d3, and now b4. And this position had occurred on Grandmaster level a few times, 2 times if I'm not wrong. And the usual move here has been knight to a4, then might follow knight b d7 and e4. But it looks like Kaidanov had prepared something. At least it looked very ambitious. So knight to e4, and black plays knight b to d7, and now Kaidanov takes on f6, check, knight takes f6, and now he plays e4. Black plays bishop to b7, white castles, black castles, and now after black has castled, Kaidanov goes for e5. And now the knight has to move. The knight goes to d7, and now we can see we have a pawn on e5, which is controlling f6, a very important feature of this pawn on e5. White has a knight on f3, which might jump to g5 at some point, and probably the most important piece, the bishop on d3. This is a very strong attacking bishop because it's putting pressure on h7. And now white played bishop to e7, and the main line here, so this position was played a few times, and what happens to be the main line is rook b8, defending this bishop on b7 and enabling the move c5. So then usually moves like queen to c2 might happen. So this is putting pressure on h7, less on c6 because it's defended once, only once, but we will see why taking it will not work. So black usually plays h6, and taking here is just bad because of moves like rook c8. And now the bishop has a problem because the queen on c2 is much more valuable than the bishop or the knight. So, and also the rook. So white is in huge trouble. If he goes like this, then just rook takes, and pawn and rook for the queen are not very promising. So let's just go back. This does not work. But after h6, white just plays rook d1 in similar positions. And then might happen c5 anyway, and the bishops will be exchanged. The position is probably around equal. Maybe white has some slight chances. But let's go back. Instead, black decided to move the queen. But before we move the queen, let's see what the queen is doing. First, the queen is obviously defending the bishop on e7, and bishop and queen are covering the g5 square twice, and white is also covering it twice. So if the queen does not move the black queen on d8, then white will need to prepare with an additional move if he really wants to play a piece or a pawn to g5. So why is this important? Well, let's take a look at this pawn structure. This pawn on h7 might be weak if black loses control over g5. And now let's just see what happened in the game. Queen to b6, giving up the control over g5 the second time, so the bishop is still controlling it, and also giving up the defense of the bishop on e7 here. And now white plays the very logical bishop to g5. And now black has a dilemma. He doesn't want to take on g5, but the bishop is not protected, so something should be done. And probably the best move here, as sad as it is queen to d8, defending the bishop on e7 again, and white just won a tempo. Instead, in the game, Jorden van Foreest decided to take on g5. Now it is your turn. I will give you a couple of seconds. Try to find the best move. So what Jorden van Foreest had missed was Kaidanov's very strong not knight takes g5, putting pressure on h7, but bishop takes h7 immediately, and it's check. So Van Foreest is basically forced to take the bishop on h7. The alternative isn't very promising either, and this might end in a mate very fast. So not that promising. So Van Foreest took on h7. Then followed knight takes g5 check. And in this typical Greek gift sacrifice, this bishop takes h7 or bishop takes h2 check is usually called the Greek gift sacrifice. This knight g5 move is very typical. And then black has a couple of moves. The easiest to refute is king to g8, because then follows queen h5. And now there is this mate. Black can't really do anything against it. Well, he can play knight f6, but then the knight gets taken and there is again this threat of checkmate. And now nothing can be done. The story would be different if this bishop was on a6 and could go to d3. But it's not. So this is not working. King to g8 is not working. So what about king to g6? Well, then queen to g4, and the king is very bad positioned, and knight maneuvers will win white the game. So another move, the probably worst here is king h8, even worse than king g8, because then follows check and checkmate. So this doesn't work either. So Van Foreest decided to go for king to g6, then followed queen to g4, and f5 was played. And as I mentioned earlier, this pawn on e5 is controlling f6, but here you don't want to take en passant, because otherwise the knight takes and black should be fine here, a piece up. So let's go back. Queen to g3 played instead, and just to mention, f4 is useless because of queen g4, and the queen is where it standard a move ago. So black decided to take on d4, and now it's important to realize a move. This discovery attack, knight takes e6 check, can be answered by queen g4. Otherwise the queen would be lost, because it is attacked here. So queen g4 is a very important resource. And of course, Kaidanov, being a very strong player, saw this and just played knight to e4 check. And suddenly there is no queen g4. King has to move. The king goes to h7. Then followed queen h4 check. And now it is your turn. Why did black refrain from playing king to g8? Well, I hope you saw the reason. It's not that difficult. It's knight f6 check. Let's say g takes f6 and the queen is hanging. So there is a discovery attack. Therefore the king went to g6 again. Then followed queen g5 check, king to f7, and now there is something which white had probably seen many moves ago. The 7th rank is incredibly weak. Therefore follows rook a to d1, and black decided to take on e5. So this coverage is very important, because if queen takes e4 follows, the game is over after queen e7 checkmate, or queen takes g7 checkmate. So both moves don't work. So therefore queen takes e5, at least protecting g7. But after rook takes d7, king g8, white won back the sacrificed piece, but is also attacking this piece, so he just takes it. And the issue now is still this piece cannot be taken because there is this pin. The pawn is pinned. So if the pawn takes queen, not very good. And the game here is basically over. So queen takes b2 was played, knight to c5, going to e6 probably, rook f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7, and now, as you can see, white is just a rook up, black has no compensation at all, rook d1 played, so now the rook joins the attack, queen e5, rook d7 check, king to g8, h4, now follows rook e8, queen to g6, and black decided to call it a day and resigned. Let's see why. Okay, he's a piece down. This is very bad, but even moves like rook c8 will be punished rather sooner than later, because there's this knight takes e6, and now there's just too much pressure against g7. So I hope you enjoyed this very beautiful game by Gregory Kaidanov. And it's incredible that someone at his age, 64, is still rated above 2550 and wins against someone who is a Super-Grandmaster. As mentioned, I hope you liked it, and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more of such videos, and see you. Bye.